Welcome to Trine Days the Journey, conversations with publisher Kris Millegan. I am Bruce the Taurus. With us are Richard Kerr, Colin Wallace, and Father Sean McManus to discuss the Kincora sex scandal, how it went far beyond one foster home, and the status of Richard's high court action, which he began in 2015. And now, Kris Millegan.
Thank you, Bruce, very, very much. And gentlemen, thank you very, very much for coming aboard here and talking about this. This is mostly going to be some education for a lot of people, because here in the United States, we really haven't heard about the Kincora scandal. I mean, we've heard, a little bit about Jimmy Savile, and we've heard a little bit about the one in Scotland, Dunblane, and whatnot. But there's been a lot more perfidy that has happened. And Father Sean, why don't you start us off and give us a little history of what happened there?
Well, really, the Richard and Colin are probably the best to lead with that. But let me tell you why I got involved, because I was very conscious that when Protestants in Northern Ireland ever decide to speak publicly against British intelligence or the power structure, they're very easily isolated. In the Catholic community, when they speak out or get into trouble, there's definite solidarity. The Catholic community, irrespective of their views, rally around this victim, whatever he was a victim of. But in the Protestant community, granting the situation, that person who speaks the truth is totally shunned and isolated. And that, as a person born from Fermanagh, in Fermanagh, that struck a chord with me, which tells you, you see, irrespective, and this is, but the only good news out of all of this is that it shows you that despite maybe strong political differences, people from that region can sympathize with victims. So I was proud to stand with Richard because I know to some degree some of the horrible. He was from the Protestant community, loyal and faithful to the British rule in Ireland, and yet they did this to him and refused him justice. And still to this moment of speech, they're still denying him justice to a royal subject of Her Majesty, His Majesty, and this is how he's treated. It's deeply, deeply deplorable to me, and that's why I stand in solidarity with this man and also with Colin, because Colin was a distinguished member of the army and the police and the intelligence community. And yet when he spoke the truth and blew the whistle, he was shunned and set up and demonized and excluded.
Right.
That's how the power structure works. I will leave it at that, Kris, for the
okay, yeah,
experts on it.
It's very, similar to here. We had a scandal. We call it the Franklin scandal, and it got shunned. The author who wrote it, he got dropped by his agency, dropped by all. He knew everybody in New York. It was going to come out from New York. It didn't happen. Okay, they wouldn't talk about it. Now, Colin, that's quite the background to step up and tell the truth about. And if you could also tell the people about your documentaries and set it up for Richard here to tell his story.
Well, I grew up in Northern Ireland, although my parents were from Scotland. And during the war, my father was with the Royal Air Force. He went abroad and he died in the service. As a result, my mother and I moved to Northern Ireland where her parents lived. And so I basically grew up with my grandparents. After grammar school, I was started to train in pharmacy. And then the troubles began to develop, and I joined the Reserve Army, Territorial Army Volunteer Reserve. 1968, I then took on a full-time role at the Army's headquarters just outside Belfast. And 1 year later, the Army then deployed on peacekeeping duties, actually in Derry. I was sitting at my desk in the headquarters, and my boss came in and he said to me, "Pack your bags, you're off to Derry." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because we're going in at 5 o'clock. And there was a battalion already landed, it was in waiting. And at 5 o'clock, I walked over the bridge in Derry with the very first soldiers who deployed on peacekeeping duty." And the remarkable thing was the rioting that was going on locally stopped, absolutely stopped. There was no aggression towards the soldiers at all. And the lasting memory I have is of members of the police literally sitting or lying on the footpath. They were so exhausted. They didn't have gas masks, but they were firing CS gas. And so they were using wet handkerchiefs to try and stop the effects of the gas. They were exhausted. They really couldn't do anything. And so that was it. Basically, the city went quiet. And I went back to the police station that night, and I slept on a billiard table because there were bodies everywhere. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, someone shook me and said, "You've got to go. There's a helicopter coming to pick you up because we're going into Belfast at 5 o'clock. So I flew down to Belfast, and the army then deployed into the Falls Road the following night. So that was really a spectacular opening. And I think it was also the honeymoon period because local people didn't quite know what to expect from the British Army. And the British Army had no idea what they were going to expect from the locals. And in the days that followed, my role was quite useful because people kept asking me for what is this about, and what's that, and what does this mean? And I spent a lot of time explaining to units just the basics of the history of the conflict and so on and so forth. And then things did settle down for a bit. And then, unfortunately, there were undercurrents on both sides because the loyalist paramilitaries, they were very upset that their army, as they saw it, was siding now with the Republicans. It was totally untrue. Our job was to keep the peace between the two. And I think from then on, what happened was that there was almost a hidden war below the surface of people carrying out assassinations, carrying out bomb attacks. And a lot of those attacks were just to anger the population and to keep the conflict going. It wasn't achieving anything. It was creating a conflict. And it was very, very difficult to deal with that because, you know, it's like trying to get hold of a jelly that the tighter you grip it, the more it moves. And so then with the passage of time, I was there through internment. But by 1974, the conflict had changed quite dramatically because we were then very much in the clandestine war where lots of informers, intelligence and special branch people doing all sorts of things that quite frankly they shouldn't have been doing. But then at that stage, I suppose London really didn't want to know. It was over there. Those were the words that were quite often used. It wasn't spoken about that somehow Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. It was different. And that little narrow stretch of water just made it another world. And I think to some extent that allowed Parliament almost to close their eyes to what was happening. You know, nobody, people took the official version, but nobody challenged and said, is this the right thing to do? Or well, this doesn't match up with what I hear. And so the last period of my time there was very, very difficult. And really it was during that period of time when I became aware of the abuses at Kincora, because again, one of the main perpetrators there was a very key figure in the Orange Order. He was a key figure in the Unionist bloc. And for that reason, nobody ever wanted to believe that a person of that nature would be abusing children. In fact, he'd been doing it for years elsewhere. And then he managed to get a prominent role in Kincora where Richard was. So that's really where our two worlds began to come together.
Okay. Well, Richard, I applaud your courage, okay, to talk about this, because a lot of people, they would run the other direction. They wouldn't want to talk about it. And we need to talk. This horrendous acts need to be exposed, because I don't care what somebody thinks of statecraft and what they're doing, but there's no reason for these crimes to happen. And if they happen, they shouldn't be covered up by our government, So, Richard, I mean, what do you want to say about the situation? And talk about your court case too, please.
Well, okay. This is very complicated, but I'm going to try to just, in this short time we have, is try to give a general part of this in a general way. I've had years of counseling, so I'm pretty well stable in expressing my experience. So,
Good.
It all started when I was removed at the age of 5. And then I was placed in state homes. These were run by the government. And then the abuse started in the very first state home. And I don't need to go into details of that, but and then I was transferred to another facility, another state home, run by 3 men that ran that facility. But during that time, I was based on the fact that I belonged to the state and they had control over me. And, they were my guardian. And I had different guardians coming and out. So it was, it became very confusing looking back at that. I was introduced, I was taken to facilities. I was introduced to older men. I had to perform certain acts. I've given locations and addresses. And this was just an ongoing situation. And a lot of this stuff became normal for me. And, looking back at this, it was all done for political reasons. They wanted to have leverage over certain politicians, departments, and everything else. Now, what's so important, who was running these operations were the bottom man, and then you had special branch was definitely involved, who would coordinate those situations. Then they would report to MI5 and MI6, and they would be the ones who would try to, bottom line, to try to blackmail people to come onto their side.
Right.
Okay. This is, and I'll give you an experience of that. They had somebody, his name was called John McCary. Now, he owned a business shop in the old Boot Ridge Road, that's one of the locations. But his drinking buddies or cronies were a person called Brian Nelson. and him and Brian would hang out at the Park Avenue Hotel. John was also had a connection to William McGrath. They communicated. They came to visit the facility. The police that the RUC knew about this was going on, these activities. So it was arranged for me to go to the hotel at the Park Avenue in the bar area. And then I was directed to go upstairs to one of the rooms. And the way they would operate this, well, let's keep this simple. The client was never the one who booked the room. The room was booked by one of the people who were arranging it. And in those days, what they did was they would have the key to the door. So they would give the key to the abuser to use the room.
Yeah.
And that's how they made those arrangements. So they were good about not having any paper trail when it came into checking into a hotel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was brought into the room, and they were filming John, because the room next door, when I left the room, they brought me into the next room, and I saw the old cameras.
Yeah.
Yeah. The old cameras back in those days.
Yeah.
The Kodak, the Kodak camera that sits on a blue box.
Yeah.
So I knew, at that moment, I'm thinking, okay, what's going on, But as a boy, you're thinking in your head, this is, you're not really grasping the effects of that, But anyway, I was told to go back downstairs, and they tried to. John was financially well off. Most of these people who cross over needed money, so it always. The intelligence services would always use those ways of providing money. And John was a hard nut to crack.
Ah.
Okay.
So you.
And he was part of he used to be Aim Paisley's bodyguard for a while. And Aim Paisley, where Aim Paisley residence was 4 streets up from Kincora. He lived off the Newton Road, and he lived 4 streets up from Kincora. So he had that connection with William McGrath, John McCreary, and Brian Nelson. Okay. So they all were in that same network around that area of East Belfast. Because I remember, and I couldn't understand the brown envelopes. When William McGrath would give me a brown envelope and give me a half shilling to deliver to Aim Paisley's store, with his bodyguard coming at the front door, and it was 4 streets up from the Newton Road, and I would hand it on the weekends. I would hand this envelope. I never opened the envelope, but I was just always looking for the half crown. So I would knock on the door, and it was a black door with a gold ring, and that's where he resigned, Aim Paisley. So these MPs always had their connections, and I was dragged into the deep of this, and I can go on to other incidents and stuff.
Right. Well,
and then right now at the courts, I have gotten a win on the police lawsuit, and they when I was in the court room last week, a week ago, they saw me on the laptop, and they conceded.
So
the court only lasted a half an hour. Yeah.
Well,
the defense conceded.
That's wonderful.
And I don't know. Well, it sounds all right, but I think that's they may have something up their sleeves, and I believe when it comes to the disclosing process, where you have to disclose information, I think that's where they're going to have a way to drag their feet, because they don't want any of this to come out.
Right. Well, these are called honey traps. Okay. in the intelligence parlance, and basically to have a honey trap, okay, you have to have a room, okay, you have to have some little boys and girls, okay, and then you've got to, have the ability to, videotape it, audio tape it and stuff like that. And then you need a manager of this thing, okay? And the manager is going to want some security, okay? So, I mean, these are big, major operations, and they aren't doing this just for giggles, okay? I mean, there's some hard intelligence and some hard political things that they're trying to accomplish, okay, with these things, and so I mean, we've had them here in the United States. I mean, they happen. I would suggest in most countries where people are looking for power and to stay in power, because blackmail is a powerful tool, and and sex is something that overcomes a lot of people and gets them in trouble. Okay, so
well,
what age did you? How did you get out? I mean, how did you start talking about this? What?
Well, as I say, this gets complicated. This is a long lifetime experience. When I was transferred to the United States, I was under some of the control still. This gets complicated.
Okay, so you did some of this blackmail activity in the United States. You were brought over here to do blackmail activity?
No. Some of that was done in United England, in Europe. Okay. But those who were some of them who were in charge of that needed to close down the operation. So in order to do that, you got to get rid of the asset. Let's put it like that. So they don't usually. They have two options. They could, they had that operation to work at where it'd be best if he goes to another country.
Okay.
Okay, and since some of the people I knew from back then had connections to the United States, especially New York, and they had connections to them. I mean, this is so much. I could never ever express this within this short time, because I could go back to when you're asking a question, I have to revert back to Europa Hotel, where all the journalists were there. There was a journalist named there. He worked for the Irish Times, Henry Kelly. He was a young man at that time. He stayed at Henry Kelly. He was a journalist who worked for the Irish Times, and he was a young man that he stayed at Europa Hotel. It was a residence, and he caught on to some of this. So, because a lot of journalists stayed at Europa Hotel, it was the most bombed hotel in Europe. And then eventually I was given a job there to monitor the residents that were going in there.
And so
it just gets.
Who did you report to? Who did you report to? Did they pay you?
I would say later on.
Colin, what you did a documentary about Richard's story?
Yes.
What's the name of the documentary, and where can people find it?
Well, I think the one that we were talking about is The Man Who Knew Too Much. But there have been several other small pieces or smaller news items that have been made. And I mean, I've lost track of them because there were quite a few over the years. But I will have a look and see if I can identify any of those, and I'll give you the names of them.
Are they available on YouTube? Can people find them on YouTube?
I don't honestly know. I need to check. I'll speak to my lawyers because they tend to keep a lot of my archive stuff, and I'll see if they've got records of any of them.
Okay.
I think there's just one point, I think, to support what Richard said. You see, a lot of this happened to some extent because of the security situation in Northern Ireland. You know, the police were busy doing other things. And so things like prostitution, child abuse, and everything else, that didn't really appear as a crime when people were being shot and bombs were going off. And the other issue, I think, too, is that the police had a problem because they were local, and therefore they had to be very careful about how involved they got with one side or the other. So the army was sitting in the middle of that. And just to give you an idea of how complex that background was, in 1973, the British government decided that they were going to give Northern Ireland a separate political system. It was devolving power to Northern Ireland. And while that sounded a good thing, and also it was enabling Westminster to distance itself from what happened, the key thing that William McGrath, who was one of the main abusers at the time, he then reacted very, very negatively to that. And he issued a proclamation. And the proclamation, public, said that the Roman Catholic Church was to be made illegal, the same as a terrorist organization, that all Catholic schools were to be closed, and that all religious instructions in Catholic schools was to be carried out by evangelical Protestants. Now, that is so outrageous that people would laugh at it and say, never happened. It did. And you can get copies of that declaration. Now, what was interesting about that, you see, this was a man who was very close to the Reverend Ian Paisley, who was very close to all evangelical type people, and yet he was one of the biggest child abusers of the period. But he had this ability to stand up. And in the early days, he worked with Ian Paisley, trying to bring down the Northern Ireland Prime Minister Terence O'Neill. Terence O'Neill was a moderate. Terence O'Neill literally came from a different world. He had a very privileged background. He'd been in the army, but he was so moderate, his own people disliked him. And therefore, what they wanted were really the rabble rousers at that stage, because that was the way Irish politics, Northern Irish politics was going. So you could see at that stage that it was drifting further down the road to some form of chaos. And therefore, things like Richard's experiences really diminished in terms of significance, unfortunately, and they became less and less important. That's why, again, they got away with this, because people didn't want to know. Now, in 1973, I then spoke to my superiors about this, about McGrath, and they, to be fair to them, said, I was given permission then to brief the press about what was going on, and I was actually given a brief to put into a press pack. And I did give it to several journalists who later on admitted it, but nobody published it. Yeah. Not one single newspaper would touch it. And of course, that's why people like McGrath, John McKagan, all of these people who were involved in abuse, they managed to keep on going, because that world of Ireland, which in many ways is a very religious community, just shut their eyes to what was happening. They didn't want to know.
Father McManus, if I can ask you to educate us poor Americans here a little bit, because, you know, yeah, we kind of know that Northern Ireland is there and there was the Troubles and blah, 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 blah. But, you know, we really don't know a lot about Ireland or Irish history. Okay. And, you know, I mean, I really don't quite understand how come, you know, I mean, it's all one island, you know, and why it shouldn't be all one country. But so this religious thing between the, you know, the Catholics and the Protestant, and then you got the evangelicals, it's quite a mess to a certain extent. But can you educate us about, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and what it means.
Well, England has one way or another been involved in Ireland since, if I get the date wrong, Colin, correct me, 1169, 855 years and counting. Almost 1,000 years, almost 1,000 years. And for all sorts of reasons, sometimes they dominated it completely, but they always ruled Ireland, as you said, as one country, one unit. And not only that, but their center of rule, their British center of administration was in Dublin. Never saw two countries there ever until 1920. There was a fairly successful revolution in the southern part of Ireland, and the British knew the game was up and they had to move. They couldn't control the entire island. So what did they do? In the best empire policy and tradition, they said, partition. We will siphon off a tiny little corner of Ireland, 6 counties up there in the northeast, in such a way that there's for every Protestant, there's only one Catholic. We have a permanent, or at that time, so they thought, a permanent majority of pro-British people who happened to be Protestants. Now, it was quite deliberate in one way, but here's the thing. If the Catholics in Northern Ireland or in the rest of Ireland had been Jewish and opposed the empire, they'd be treated exactly like the Catholics. And if the Catholics had in fact been Protestants if the Catholics had been loyal to Britain and the Protestants disloyal, the Protestants would have been treated like the Catholics. So it had very little to do with religion. Religion was used in a time-honored way of divide and conquer.
Yeah.
They did it all over the world.
Yeah.
I think I could just add something to that, because
Sure.
what, in fact, Father Sean is saying is very important. I grew up in a farming community in Northern Ireland, in Antrim, and there we had a mixture of mainly Protestant farmers and Catholic farmers. But in the harvest time, the Catholic farmers would go and help the Protestants and vice versa. I never experienced any religious conflict in the whole of my youth. It was only later that suddenly these demarcation lines were called in. And it was really very strange. And then coming back into it as a soldier in the 70s, the world had changed entirely. And it was so sad, because that's not the way Ireland works. It's one of the most hospitable countries on earth. And yet, this shows how suddenly a community can be turned against itself with very, very little effort.
Yeah, radicalizing people. Well, Richard, so who are you taking to court? Are you taking the government to court? Are you taking people to court? Who are you in court talking to?
Well, we're trying to take the government, the institutions, basically.
Okay.
That's where the system was, where they manipulated a lot of this to cover it up. So it's really the institutions, the welfare departments, the police departments. It's going to be very difficult to get to the intelligence services.
Right.
But, we're looking at the system. That's where I was vulnerable. I was very vulnerable. I was under their control.
Yeah.
Because I was placed in the system. These people had to answer to the system. The police had to answer to the system. The system controlled the police, the branches higher up. You got the Home Office, who's really in charge of what MI5 have to report to. You got the RUC, at that time were called the RUC, who had to report to Special Branch. So you had these individual systems, and they were organized in these traps, let's say, because they're, you know, the bottom line is the dirty war started in 1969, and things really heated up in 1972. Around that year, we had Bloody Sunday and Bloody Friday. Things were just going really, really bad. The Protestants were so paranoid about losing their rights, even though the Catholics were being discriminated. This is all about discrimination back then. They were, you know, I experienced this, and they were treated as a second-class citizen.
Right.
And that's what was happening. And with the war and the troubles going on, they needed to have leverage over these politicians who are running these institutions. That is as simple as that.
Yeah.
And they did the same thing in Germany during World War II, this kind of setup. And you got to think about the times back then. Homosexuality was a bad word.
Yeah.
Number two, not regardless of what age you were then, what age I was a child, but I know that's bad. But even knowing that, homosexual was a bad word, especially for those who were working out of the Church of England. You got to understand that a lot of these politicians were involved in the church. The Reverend Anne Paisley was called the Reverend Anne Paisley, you know. So you had this explosion, and William McGrath wanted to open up his own church. So you can see what was going on, and if you really look deep, I know it's hard, you got to be there. So, and then, you know, we were sacrificed. We were collateral damage to help out in a torn country in the north, and that, and you know, and they wanted to clean it up.
Right.
So they set up these phony inquiries. When Margaret Thatcher became prime minister of May 1979, that's when they tried to cover it up, and so that no one could speak out about it. That's the reason why they locked Colin Wallace up in 1980 when the scandal broke. And it was my social workers who had the conscience, because they're conscious, they had to go to the Irish Independent Times to a journalist called Peter McKinnon. And that's what broke the scandal. But what really broke the camel's back was the death of Stephen Warren in November of 1977. The fact that he lost his life on the Liverpool ferry. And the inquiries opened up because the police didn't have their control. The Northern Ireland police didn't have their control over Stephen Warren because the death took place in the mainland of England. So they're the ones who got involved. So all I'm going to say is this is not conspiracy theories, number one, because I have evidence that I can back up what I said. This has been looked at, dissect, information there. This could be corroborate with other witness. During that time, they assassinated some of the witness, and assassinated one of the people that I abused. I mean, who abused me? John, when he was about to go and tell their names at a certain court procedures in 1981. It was 1981. So go ahead.
So
this is what I'm saying. I know this is hard road and this is complicated, but this is not. There's so much evidence there that it's unbelievable why they want to cover it up. Well, I know why they want to cover it up. Number one, it's an embarrassment. It's called embarrassment. The British are always pride people. Oh, we don't do this kind of thing. It's all pride, there was no saying about Britain, Great Britain, or whatever. So it's a lot to do with that. So there is a war going on still, not the war that I was brought up in, but the war, I just leave you with this. The war is called the war for justice.
Amen.
Because they're trying to close that down. Not just with me. Father Sean is helping someone else who lost his son. And they are trying to cover that up. And he has been fighting for that for the last 10, 12 years. There's a lot of other victims who've been trying to fight for justice. That is the war we're dealing with today.
Right.
If I could add this, Kris, please. Nobody ever accused me of being pro-British regarding England's control of Ireland. But let me tell you, at the beginning, before I knew much about this, I would have found it hard to believe
Amen.
that MI5 would so ethically, cruelly, and coldly set up an arrangement that abused Richard and all the other kids. That took me a while to believe, because irrespective of what one thinks of the British government, and I think a lot of bad about it, but one accepted a certain amount of professionalism and honesty from the MI5, for God's sake.
Right.
Like you do of the FBI in this country.
Right.
And to think that for years and years and years, that deliberately had their agent in Kincora systematically abusing Protestant boys in their care and outside their care in other places. That is really hard for people to fully accept.
Yeah. The Franklin scandal, we had FBI running cover for that honey trap too, and it took me a long time to say, really?
But can I add something here to
Yes.
what Father John said? I
Yes.
think it's important. Okay. You ask yourself the question, who would have been able to open up the doors to help me with the immigration? Number one. Two, why was the papers transferred out of sight for me to come here? Okay. Why was I told to go to the back of the American embassy and speak to the American ambassador alone in his office, where he was able to forward those papers by influence by lawyers in New York? Who would have had this? Who would have to go away with the British government to be able to allow that stuff to go on unless they wanted me out of the country? So who would have had the power in order to pull these switches?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot of that stuff. So that is evidence itself, because I'm speaking here from Dallas. That's evidence. My whole life has been controlled here. How, after all those years in Ireland, no education, how come I can become and have a high clearance with the federal government, given a high clearance to when I was working for them to transfer sensitive information to certain locations here in Texas? Okay, so where do I get that clearance from?
Yeah.
And they do a 25-year background check.
Yeah.
So I'm saying is the evidence speaks for itself, because the living evidence speaks for itself.
Right.
I just want to share that.
Yeah. So did the system ever give you an apology, Richard? I mean, has anybody from the government talked to you about this? Now you're going to court and you say you won something yesterday, but I'm just...
No, I won something a week ago.
a week ago.
Okay.
So
well, they when they had the HIA inquiry, they had someone there who is a campaigner that they brought into the circle, let's say, and they kind of apologized with the Stormont Assembly at that time, but they weren't direct. It was not a direct apology. It was just a apology to people that were brought up in institutions.
Okay.
But that is as far as they go, because you see, an apology is to them is admitting they did something wrong. So I guess they're going to try to figure that out. And if it does come, it may not come in the fact, if I win these lawsuits, I know I can win 2 of them. And I know I've won this appeal because there's evidence that they could not fight. So the fact of the matter is that they will probably try to go along the lines, let's keep this under the radar, get him to sign a document. Let's say, yeah, we'll give him some financial help, blah, 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 and not talk about it. And I think that is the way they're going to try to do this.
Okay. So Colin, is this a big story in Ireland at all? I mean, do people
Major
talk about
story.
it in Ireland? What?
There certainly is a growing interest. I know at the moment there are 4 books on production for later this year on Kincora, and it seems to have almost regenerated itself, mainly because new information is coming out. And I think that with the passage of time, you know, sometimes information's on file that's highly significant, but people now don't realize it's significant. It was to people back then, but suddenly it makes a huge difference. For example, about 4 years ago, when I should go back a step, in 1974, remember the previous year, my army superior said to brief the press about McGrath, which I did do, and people didn't write about it. And then we were getting more reports about abuse. And in 1974, towards the end of 1974, I wrote a 4-page memo about Kincora and related matters. And I submitted that to my superiors. And that was, I think it was about the 8th of November. Now, at that stage, my career was on the way up. I had 3 recommendations for the MBE. I'd gone into a senior role, and I was summoned to the MOD, and they said, we're going to move you for career development purposes. And I was moved almost overnight, and that was the end. Now, then after that, it was very difficult to get people to accept my argument. And about 4 years ago, the then permanent Under Secretary at the Ministry of Defence, a really good man, who knew nothing about this, I had a false job description to cover what I was really doing. And I was disciplined under the false job description, not the real one. And the police later on said that was fraud by the MOD. It was the Metropolitan Police, not the RUC. And they submitted it to the DPP in London, and he wouldn't allow the police to investigate. The second thing that happened was that the MOD, somebody found a reference to my secret job description. And they took it to the head of the MOD and said they found this document. And Sir Michael Quinlan then thought, this is serious. We have to do something about this. Now, I've got the correspondence now. And what he said was there has to be a public admission. Has to be a public admission. And he passed it to a senior politician to implement that. And the politician said what he was going to do was to bring in a senior lawyer to look at the matter. But this is the key thing. It had to exclude him looking at 3 things. And one of those was Kincora.
Wow.
And we have that in writing.
Wow.
And he never knew he was misled. And he did a proper job, and he found in my favor, but he didn't realize the significance of the 3 things that were kept from him.
Yeah.
Now, my argument on this, you see, in a democracy, at the end of the day, you cannot have a group of unelected people changing the democratic process. Because once you do that, that is real tyranny. And that's what was happening because, and I come back to this, we had 1,441 soldiers killed in Northern Ireland, who died in Northern Ireland. Of those, half, roughly, was the direct result of engagement with terrorists. It's a lot of people. They were in Northern Ireland, rightly or wrongly, at the behest of their government. That's correct, that's democracy. But if you then mislead Parliament in such a way that they make bad judgments, what happens? You end up then with inquiries that we have today, where the whole thing is so convoluted that you can't get at the truth. And even the Boucher inquiries you see at the moment, it is quite clear the areas that they're not able to look at because of the government issue what they call a PPI certificate, which says you can't have that information. And they're walking away.
Wow.
And I've just written a letter on that tonight because I just think this is again totally absurd after all of these years. The Parliament that we use in our democratic system is prevented from having the information to enable them to make good judgments. That to me is unacceptable. And I think it's an insult to the families of the soldiers who died in Northern Ireland just as much as it is to the members of the community who died, because they're all victims.
And Colin, this would be appropriate to mention that today, May 1st, all inquests have come to an end about the troubles in Ireland. No more inquests.
My belief, you
no
see,
more
is
inquests done.
War have
they have stretched this out to
by an
make
act
sure
of the British Parliament,
correct,
by the King in Parliament, which
Yeah.
is the official language of saying the King plus the British government passed this into law.
Wow. Well,
And what
where-
actually happens now, you
Where
see
does that happen? You know, where
No
else
matter-
does that happen?
no matter what the Boucher detectives find, they know now that there will be no prosecutions.
wow.
And I've written a whole package on this, which I've sent to my solicitors at the moment to go to Boucher, because this is just, again, misleading. If they had really wanted to allow Boucher to report and then go to prosecutions and then stop further inquiries, but you cannot set up an inquiry and then stop it halfway through because the findings can't be used thereafter. It's now dead, it's finished. There's no way they're going to go back and
probably why they're conceited.
Yeah, that kudos, Colin. I mean, you it sounds that you sacrificed your career around this situation.
Totally.
Now, Father, today is there can be no more inquiries. The thing is just
The law was passed with the King's assent some months ago, stating that today, May 1st, all inquests into the past are finished. Now, here's the thing. There's obviously also an amnesty that we all know that it applies to other people apart from British soldiers. But we know very well that it's always been about them, because they don't really care what happens to the people in Northern Ireland, Protestant or Catholic. They're out to protect the King in Parliament from embarrassment. They want an end. They want an end to this. And it's Richard kindly mentioned our other friend here, Raymond McCord, who's an extraordinary man, a Belfast Protestant, a loyal man whose son wore the uniform, for God's sake, of the British Air Force. That kid, that 22-year-old young man, was killed by agents of the police and MI5. And his death and murder has been covered up, even though the ombudsman years back ruled that it was a case of collusion. And yet Raymond McCord, for 22 years, has been fighting for justice. And you know what every other year, the people who were being sued would come to the court and say to the judge, Your Honor, we don't have the manpower to produce the documents.
Ah,
And they got away with that for 22
Yeah.
years.
I know.
Now,
It's
here's the
ridiculous.
government and the power structure that, if needed, they could dispatch 30,000 soldiers to Belfast, what, Colin, in 5 hours' time, just like that. But for 22 years, they can't, for lack of manpower, come up with some documents.
right.
Very
Bruce,
true.
It's
Very
the
true.
essence of a cover-up.
right. Bruce, do you have any questions or comments?
When did the
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. When did the Kincora scandal break, and what caused it to bubble up into public notice?
Well, it
I'll let Colin
bubbled,
that too.
it bubbled up in the press in 1982. It had been running around a lot. It was quite interesting. You see, when I left Northern Ireland at the very beginning of 1975, the abuse went on for quite a long time after that. And then one newspaper got hold of the story. What was quite interesting about that, the newspaper published the allegations. And then 4 months later, I was arrested and charged with murder.
Yeah.
And then the charge was reduced to manslaughter. And then I spent 10 years inside. And then when I was released, they discovered the Home Office pathologist had faked the evidence. Now, this is on record. I then went back to the appeal court and the conviction was quashed. Now, the Home Office pathologist should have been prosecuted for corruption, but he was terminally ill with cancer and he died. But you see, they knew at the time that this was rigged. And I can't prove it, but it seems an amazing factor that the first press expose, because they knew I'd been trying to get the press to Kincora for a long time, the first real publication of the Kincora expose was here, and a few months later, suddenly I'm on a murder charge. It could be a coincidence, but it's a very good one if it is.
And plus, the same year what Colin's talking about is when John got assassinated,
Okay.
because he was about to go to the court to testify against.
Well,
The scandal broke out on the paper 1980 of January. My social workers went to the Irish Independent Times and told them they couldn't keep it with their conscience. That's when it broke. The person who really got deeply involved in this in 1982, after they set up Colin, was a man called Kris Moore. And we got a man, Kris Moore.
yeah.
He was doing it because he was on the grind. He was looking for me. He had documents on me that he was able to get from some of his sources through the RUC, retired RUC policeman. They were concerned about
Richard, do you know he's publishing a new book on that?
Yes, I know. I've been communicating.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line is, and Father Sean is right, they're trying to do away with anybody seeking and looking into those dirty pasts. But you know, if we speak more out on this, and we, you know, they can try to close our voices, but they cannot close some of the evidence.
Amen.
That they do not know.
Agreed.
Right.
And that's why I'm very careful who I communicate with. And I can back up a lot what I say. Sometimes I don't say the words correctly because sometimes I get emotionally with this, but I'm much better today. And I have another witness to this that I have not mentioned. It was traffic to Dublin and then to Belfast. The Erode Hotel plays a big part of it because the union's facility was 2 blocks from the Europa Hotel when they blew that up in 1972, and that was affected. They would go there for their meetings, and then they would end up drinking in the Whip and Saddle bar. Aim Paisley, Knock Collingham, Anthony Blunt used to be around, who was a friend of Knock Collingham. You got Eno Parr, who knew John. I mean, and then Tommy Little hung out with Brandon Nelson. And Tommy Little was the head man of the UVF, the Ultra Volunteer Fighters of the Shankill Road. All these people were involved. And I'm saying the people at the top had dirty hands.
Yeah.
And the people who, some people who tried to expose it, who said they wanted to help, they didn't want to do that. They just wanted to gather intel for me and intel for others in order to bury it, in order to manipulate it, in order to use it as propaganda. And that's exactly what's going on here. So,
Right.
so
Well, we wish you the best. And yes, Kris Moore's book, The Kincora Scandal, Political Cover-Up and Intrigue in Ulster, is the only book on our Amazon about Kincora, and it is available.
The new one is going to be very good. It's due out about September, I think.
Okay. And
Yes.
any last words, starting with Richard and then going up to Colin and Father?
Well, I just say I thank you for this. I think it's important to unfortunately we just have to educate some people here in the United States, and we have a good support network, and you know, and I just wish I have been very patient. I've been very gutsy with this, and I've gotten a little further along in the court case. But there again, they will drag their feet when it comes to discovery. I know these people. I knew them as a young boy. I know how they operate. I lived it. And so let's just see what their next move is. And that's where I'm going to put it like that.
Thank you very much, Colin.
The system basically wants it all to go away. And that's the one thing we mustn't let happen. It's terribly important, not just our story, but I think the whole issue of collusion and all of the sectarian killings, that's part of our heritage, like it or not. But the truth must be established because there are fewer and fewer real live witnesses available. And it's terribly important to get their views on the record.
Amen. Father?
Well, to me, reconciliation between Protestants and Catholics, which is needed, is at its best when Protestants and Catholics work, not only pray, but work together for justice. Thank you for facilitating this, Kris. Thank you, Bruce. I'm very delighted to meet you all, and stay strong, Richard and Colin. I bow my hat to you.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Very good.
I'll just leave one thought with you all. If we get to do another episode, I will definitely bring up the person that helped with the immigration, and that man's name is Roy Kahn.
Okay.
Well, onwards to the to a better future. You know, we owe it to our children. Amen. Thank you very much.